In 1942, U.S. Navy pilots had a nightmare. It had a name, the Mitsubishi A6M, or simply the Zero. Today, looking at old newsreel footage, we just see an old plane with red circles on its wings. But for a 19-year-old kid from Kansas who had just finished flight school and found himself over the Coral Sea, that silhouette meant one thing. Your chances of making it back to the carrier for dinner just dropped to nearly zero. In the early years of the war in the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't just winning. They were dominating. Their pilots were the elite, the samurai of the sky, with thousands of flight hours. And their primary tool, the Zero fighter, seemed to treat the laws of physics as mere suggestions. It could turn practically on a dime. It climbed faster than you could think. It had incredible range. American pilots reported things to command that engineers in Detroit and New York refused to believe. "I couldn't hit it," they wrote in their reports. "It danced around me. I felt like I was trying to drive a truck in a Formula One race." This gave birth to what historians would later call the myth of the Zero. In the mess halls of the Enterprise and the Yorktown, stories were whispered that this plane was impossible to shoot down in a fair fight, that the Japanese had created a superweapon. Morale plummeted. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with a sense of doom, knowing their equipment was inferior to the enemy's in every metric. Every sortie became a game of Russian roulette. If you saw the Zero first, you had a chance. If he saw you first, you were already dead. Your plane just hadn't stopped flying yet. America needed an answer. Not just a new plane. They needed a miracle. Something that could stop this aerial phantom. But to defeat a demon, you first have to understand its nature. Why was the Zero so fast? Why was it so maneuverable? The answer to that question lay in one terrifying detail of Japanese engineering. A detail that simply wasn't there. And that absence became the key to their destruction. The secret to the Zero's superiority wasn't ancient magic. It was pure, ruthless mathematics. Japan is an island nation. They have few resources. Little oil, little steel, little aluminum. When Chief Designer Jiro Horikoshi received the order from the Navy, the requirements seemed impossible. The military wanted a fighter that flew further than anyone else, faster than anyone else, and maneuvered better than anyone else. But Japan didn't have the powerful engines the Americans possessed. How do you make a plane with a weak heart fly like a god? The answer was singular. Make it light. Incredibly, dangerously light. Horikoshi put his team on a brutal diet. They fought for every gram. They used a secret alloy, extra super duralumin. It was strong, but light as a feather. But that wasn't enough. So they started removing the essentials. First, they ditched the pilot's armor plate, that heavy steel slab behind the seat that protects the flyer from bullets coming from the rear. Gone. Too heavy. Armored glass for the canopy. Gone. Regular glass is lighter. But the most terrifying decision concerned the fuel tanks. By that time in aviation, self-sealing tanks were becoming standard. This is when a tank is covered in a layer of rubber. If a bullet punctures it, the rubber swells from the gasoline and heals the hole. It saves lives. But rubber is heavy. So the Japanese said no. The Zero's tanks were simply containers of high-octane fuel hidden in the wings. Think about that. The pilot was sitting literally straddled atop 2 barrels of gasoline, unprotected by anything other than a thin sheet of aluminum the thickness of a coin. The engineers went even further. They drilled holes in gears and levers to save a few more grams of metal. In early models, they didn't even have a starter. To start the engine, mechanics on the ground had to spin the prop by hand. A starter is dead weight. And weight is the enemy. The result was staggering. The Zero weighed just over 1.5 tons. For comparison, American planes weighed 2, sometimes 3 times as much. This gave Japanese pilots a sense of absolute impunity. They could loop around the sluggish Americans. They felt like samurai whose katana was razor sharp. This engineering philosophy perfectly overlaid the Bushido code. The way of the warrior is the way of death. Why do you need armor if you don't plan on getting hit? Why do you need protection if your spirit is stronger than steel? They believed pilot skill was the best defense. The Zero was beautiful. It was an aerial ballet. But that beauty came at a terrible price. The plane was made of magnesium alloys. And magnesium, as chemists know, burns beautifully. One stray bullet hitting the wing or fuselage often led to catastrophe. Zeros didn't just crash. They flared up like matches. Pilots burned alive in seconds. But in 1941 and 1942, that didn't matter. The Americans simply couldn't hit them. The Japanese looked at the heavy armored U.S. planes with disdain. They considered them cowardly. Why do you need so much iron? Are you afraid to die? They seemed to ask with every maneuver. They didn't understand one thing. The American philosophy of war was different. While the Japanese were creating the perfect sword, on the other side of the world, in the dusty factories of Long Island, men in grease-stained coveralls were creating the perfect shield. And this shield was being forged in a place that proudly bore the nickname, the Iron Works. While engineers in Japan were trying to lighten structures by drilling holes in levers, something entirely different was happening in Bethpage, New York. This was the home of the Grumman Company, and it had a reputation. Navy pilots jokingly called it not Grumman Aerospace, but Grumman Iron Works. Why? Because their philosophy was simple and understandable to any American raised on a farm or working in a factory. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, didn't believe in fragile things. He believed that if you build a plane for war, it should be as solid as an anvil. There is a legend that Leroy once invented the folding wing mechanism for carrier aircraft using a generic eraser and 2 paper clips on his desk. That simplicity and reliability were in the company's DNA. When the Navy came to Grumman with the Zero problem, the engineers did something the Japanese would have considered weakness. They didn't guess. They didn't meditate over blueprints. They went and asked the guys returning from combat. Grumman engineers met with veterans of the Battle of Midway. It was a frank conversation. "What are you missing?" they asked. The pilots answered straight. "We need to climb higher. We need to fly faster. But for the love of God, do not take away our armor." Thus, the F6F project was born. The future Hellcat. If you put a Zero and a Hellcat side by side, the contrast is comical. The Japanese plane looks like a toy. Elegant, thin, with flowing lines. The Hellcat next to it looks like a heavyweight boxer who forgot to leave the gym. It was massive. A wingspan of 13 meters. An empty weight of over 4 tons. Fully loaded, it weighed almost as much as 3 Zeros. Grumman stuffed it with protection. The windshield was bulletproof glass, several inches thick. Behind the pilot sat a plate of hardened steel. Under the floor, around the engine, around the oil cooler, there was armor everywhere. Nearly 200 pounds of pure protection. Fuel tanks? They were self-sealing. If a bullet pierced them, the special rubber compound instantly closed the hole, preventing leaks and fire. The Japanese philosophy stated, "Avoid the blow." The American philosophy, embodied in the Hellcat, replied, "We will take the blow, and then we will hit back." It was a plane built for a war of attrition. Grumman understood, the pilot is the most valuable resource. A plane can be assembled in a week on an assembly line. Training an ace takes years. If the Hellcat brings the pilot home, even if it's turned into Swiss cheese, it has done its job. Outwardly, it seemed crude. Square wingtips, a thick fuselage, tall landing gear so the prop wouldn't clip the deck on a hard landing. When the first prototypes rolled out of the hangar, they didn't inspire aesthetic awe. It wasn't a beautiful machine. It was a tool, like a hammer, like a wrench, like a baseball bat. But the engineers had one giant problem. They had created a flying tank. It was incredibly tough, but it was heavy. By all laws of aerodynamics, this mountain of metal, armor, and weapons should have flown slightly better than a brick. To make this tank not just fly, but chase down agile Zeros, it needed a heart. A heart that pumped so much pure, unbridled energy that the laws of physics would be forced to retreat. And America gave it that heart. An engine that became a legend in its own right. To lift this 5-ton armored safe into the air, engineers turned to Pratt & Whitney. What they offered wasn't just an engine. It was a work of industrial art. The R2800 Double Wasp. Imagine 18 massive pistons arranged in 2 rows around a central shaft. Each piston the size of a paint bucket. The engine displacement was 46 liters. If you like cars, imagine the most powerful modern muscle car. Now multiply its power by 3, by 4, by 5. The R2800 put out 2,000 horsepower. 2,000. This wasn't an airplane heart. It was a locomotive engine with a propeller and wings bolted to it. When mechanics mounted this monster on the Hellcat, they were creating the most powerful single-engine machine of its time. The propeller was so huge, 4 meters in diameter, that if the plane sat horizontally on the runway, the blades would chop the concrete. That's why the Hellcat has that strange, hunched stance on the ground. It needed long legs to keep that giant prop away from the tarmac. But numbers on paper are one thing. The feeling of this machine in reality was something else entirely. When the pilot hit the starter, a small earthquake occurred. First, coughing and sneezing as the magneto ignited the mixture. Clouds of blue smoke erupted from the exhaust stacks. And then, a low, guttural growl turning into a thunderous roar. Veterans recalled that when a squadron of Hellcats warmed up their engines on the flight deck, the vibration was felt in cabins 3 decks down. The steel bulkheads of the ship resonated. Dishes in the galley rattled. It was the sound of an approaching storm, the sound of inevitable force. This engine gave American pilots something they never had before: the vertical. The Zero could turn left and right better than any bird. But the Hellcat, with its 2,000 horses, could simply point its nose at the sky and go up like a rocket. The Japanese motor choked trying to keep up. The American motor just kept pulling, devouring altitude. And it had another secret: a small toggle switch in the cockpit. The water methanol injection system. Pilots called it war emergency power. It was like nitrous in street racing. In a critical situation, the pilot flipped the switch, and the engine briefly produced even more power. It allowed you to catch anyone, or escape anyone, but most importantly, the R2800 was reliable as a sledgehammer. Japanese engines were complex and temperamental. The American Double Wasp was built to survive. There are documented cases where Hellcats returned to base with 1 or 2 cylinders shot off. Oil was spewing from the engine. It clattered like a bucket of bolts, but it kept running. It pulled the pilot home, refusing to die. It was the perfect pair: an indestructible airframe from Grumman and an unkillable heart from Pratt & Whitney. America had created its Frankenstein. It was big. It was scary. It was loud. By mid-1943, the first squadrons of these monsters were loaded onto carriers and sent west, across the Pacific, towards an enemy that still believed in its invincibility. August 31st, 1943. The sky over Marcus Island. Japanese spotters notice an approaching group of American planes. Sirens wail. Zero pilots run to their machines, buckling helmets on the go. They take to the air with habitual confidence. They look at the enemy and see a familiar silhouette: blunt nose, straight wings, barrel-shaped fuselage. Ah, they think, it's the old Wildcats again. This was the first and most fatal mistake. The fact is, Grumman engineers intentionally kept the family resemblance. The Hellcat looked like the Wildcat's big brother who had overdosed on steroids. From a distance of a mile or two, telling them apart was almost impossible. Japanese aces knew how to fight Wildcats. They were slow and clumsy. The tactic was simple: gain altitude, dive, strike, and go back up. The old American plane simply couldn't keep up with the Zero in a climb. Imagine the smirk on a Japanese lieutenant's face. He sees this fat, clumsy blue plane. He thinks, Americans never learn. They made it even bigger, even heavier. Fools. For a samurai of the sky, used to the elegant lightness of his machine, the Hellcat looked like a flying barge, an insult to aerodynamics. The Japanese pilot makes a habitual maneuver. He goes into a steep climb, expecting the American to lag behind, lose speed, and stall. He looks back, preparing to see a receding dot. But the dot isn't receding. It's getting bigger. The smile vanishes. Eyes widen. This fat plane isn't falling behind. It's hanging on the tail. And not just hanging, it's gaining. The 2,000 horsepower of the double wasp roar, tearing the air apart. What looked like a clumsy oaf suddenly leaps forward with the grace of a predator. The tone on Japanese radios changed. Instead of calm, short commands, chaos erupted. "It's not a Wildcat," pilots screamed. "It's too fast. It won't shake off." In that moment, the Japanese realized the terrifying truth. The rules of the game that had worked for 2 years had been repealed. They tried to use their main advantage, the turn. The Zero banked sharply, trying to outturn the American. Before, this worked flawlessly, but the Hellcat had huge wings, providing excellent lift. It couldn't turn quite as tightly as the Zero, but it didn't need to. It just needed to keep the enemy in its sights for a couple of seconds. And when those seconds came, the nightmare began. The Hellcat was armed with 6.5 Zero-caliber Browning heavy machine guns, 6 barrels. This wasn't just shooting, it was a wall of lead. When a Hellcat pilot squeezed the trigger, the plane threw out about 80 bullets per second. These bullets were the size of a grown man's finger. They didn't just puncture the Zero's skin. They tore off chunks. Wings fell off. Tails were sheared off like they were cut by a razor. Those same unprotected Japanese tanks we talked about earlier, under the fire of 6 Brownings, they turned into fireballs instantly. The laughter at the fat American died down very quickly. After the first major skirmishes, Japanese pilots gave this new plane a nickname. They stopped calling it Fat. They called it the Grumman Killer. But the most shocking lesson the Japanese received wasn't when they were shooting. It was when they were being shot at. Imagine the horror of a Japanese pilot. He does everything perfectly. He gets on the tail. He catches the American plane in his crosshairs. He presses the trigger. His 7.7 millimeter machine guns chatter. He sees hits. Sparks fly from the Hellcat's skin. Bullets drum against the fuselage. By all laws of war, this blue giant should start smoking, lose control, and crash into the ocean. But the Hellcat doesn't even flinch. Small Japanese bullets simply bounced off the armored hide of the American monster. They left dents. They scratched the paint. But they couldn't penetrate the hardened steel protecting the pilot and engine. For the Hellcat, it was like mosquito bites to a rhino. Annoying, but not lethal. There are photos of Hellcats returning to carriers after battle, looking like they were put through a meat grinder. Hundreds of holes. Torn pieces of rudders. Shredded wingtips. But they flew back. They landed. The pilot would climb out, inspect the holes, shrug, and go get coffee while mechanics slapped patches on. This broke the Japanese psyche. When your weapon doesn't work, you start to panic. And in that moment of panic, the Hellcat went on the offensive. The Americans quickly realized, don't play the Japanese game. Don't turn and burn. Don't try to be a ballerina. Be a sledgehammer. They used a tactic called boom and zoom. Using their monstrous power, the Hellcat would climb high above the battlefield. From there, the American pilot picked a victim. He put the plane into a dive. 5 tons of steel and aluminum accelerated to insane speeds, gravity, and the engine working together. The Hellcat fell on the Zero from above like a brick. The Japanese pilot had a split second to react. The American opened fire, screamed past, and using the momentum, shot back vertically into the safety of the sky. The Zero couldn't repeat this. If it tried to dive after the Hellcat, its fragile wings could simply rip off from the G-force. If it tried to climb, its weak motor choked. The Japanese were trapped. They could only spin below, waiting for the next hammer blow from the heavens. But the most dramatic moment came when the Hellcat actually opened fire. Remember the difference in construction. When an American .50 caliber bullet hit a Zero, the physics of destruction took over. The kinetic energy of such a round is enormous. One hit to a wing spar, and the wing folds. One hit to an unprotected tank, and the plane turns into a torch. American pilots often described it with one grim word: disintegration. It didn't look like the movies, where a plane just falls with a smoky tail. No. The Zero literally fell apart in the air. 1 second, it was a plane. The next, a cloud of burning debris and aluminum confetti. One veteran recalled a case that became the quintessence of this standoff. A Japanese ace got on a Hellcat's tail. He emptied his entire ammo belt. He saw pieces of skin flying off the American. He was sure of victory. But the Hellcat simply dropped its flaps, sharply cut its speed, forcing the Japanese pilot to overshoot. And as soon as the Zero was in the sights, the American squeezed the trigger for 1 second. Bam! The Zero vanished in a flash of an explosion, and the Hellcat, smoking and beaten, turned around and flew home. This was no longer a war of equals. It was a war of technologies, a war of philosophies, and the philosophy of steel beats paper was winning with a landslide score. But these were just skirmishes, single duels over the ocean. Command knew, sooner or later, the Japanese fleet would gather all its strength for a final, decisive blow. They would throw everything they had into the fight. And that day came in the summer of 1944. June 1944. The Philippine Sea, the largest expanse of water on the planet, was preparing to become the arena for the largest carrier battle in human history. The Imperial Japanese Navy was cornered. The American war machine was inching closer to the Japanese home islands. The Emperor needed a victory. Not just a successful battle, but a decisive battle that would destroy the American fleet in one blow and force the U.S. to sue for peace. To do this, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa gathered everything he had left. 9 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes. It was a doomsday armada, and Ozawa had a plan. On paper, it looked brilliant. The plan relied on that same advantage that made the Zero so dangerous early in the war: range. Japanese planes were light. They had huge tanks. They could fly 300 to 400 miles, strike, and return. American Hellcats, with their heavy armor and thirsty engines, had a much shorter range. Ozawa decided to play sniper. He planned to launch his planes from a safe distance where the Americans simply couldn't reach him. Japanese pilots were to fly over the American fleet, drop bombs, and then, this was the trickiest part, land on Japanese bases on the islands of Guam and Rota to refuel. It was called a shuttle bombing run. Strike, land on an island, refuel, take off, and strike again on the way back to their ships. The Japanese were confident of success. They knew the Americans had more ships. They knew the Americans had thicker armor. but they believed their range and cunning would negate that advantage. On the morning of June 19th, Ozawa gave the order. 4 giant waves of aircraft took to the sky. In total, more than 400 machines launched. Bombers, torpedo bombers, and hundreds of escort fighters. The sky darkened. It was the most powerful aerial attack history had ever seen. Ozawa sat on the bridge of his flagship, waiting for radio reports of burning American carriers. He thought he was the hunter setting traps for a bear, but he didn't know the bear could already see him. The American fleet had a secret weapon the Japanese didn't possess in such quality. Radar, but not just radar. The Americans had created a system called the CIC, Combat Information Center. Imagine a dark room in the bowels of a ship. It is packed with electronics, wires, and men in headphones staring at round green screens. At 10 a.m., a radar operator on the battleship Lee saw something strange. Usually, a plane on radar looks like a small dot, a blip. But this wasn't a blip. It was a blob, a huge, glowing smear that took up a quarter of the screen. The operator rubbed his eyes. He checked the settings. The blob didn't disappear. It was moving straight at them. Distance, 150 miles. In that second, the Americans realized the scale of what was happening. This wasn't a reconnaissance flight. This was the entire Japanese fleet. On the bridge of Admiral Mitcher, commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force, a command rang out that makes any pilot's blood boil. Scramble all fighters. The decks of the American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Hornet exploded with activity. Engines roared. Techs scrambled. Every few seconds, another Hellcat tore off the deck. They weren't just taking off. Thanks to radar, they knew exactly where the enemy was, at what altitude, and how many of them there were. They didn't need to find a needle in a haystack. They flew straight to the intercept point. Japanese pilots flew in euphoria. They saw clear skies ahead. They thought they would catch the Americans by surprise. They imagined their bombs falling on defenseless decks. But when they broke through the clouds 50 miles from the target, their hearts stopped. There were no defenseless ships in front of them. There was a wall. Hundreds of dark blue Hellcats, stacked in layers at different altitudes, were waiting for them. The Americans had taken the high ground, possessing the advantage in altitude and speed. They didn't just intercept the Japanese, they were expecting them. Ozawa's trap had snapped shut, but he was the one inside. When the two armadas collided, something happened that forever changed military aviation. It wasn't a fight, it was a shooting gallery. By 1944, Japanese aviation had lost most of its veterans. Behind the sticks sat 18-year-old boys who had barely 30 hours of flight time. They were taught only to take off, land, and die for the Emperor. They flew outdated Zeros or light bombers. Against them came American pilots in Hellcats, guys who had gone through hundreds of hours of training. They had the best sights, the best radars, and planes that forgave no mistakes to the enemy. The difference in class was catastrophic. Japanese squadrons fell apart immediately. Hellcats sliced through their formation, spraying lead. The sky over the Philippine Sea became covered in black streaks, burning Japanese planes falling. There were so many that observers on ships said it looked like it was raining burning aluminum. This was where the true power of the Hellcat as a weapons platform revealed itself. It was so stable when firing that pilots could open fire from distances they hadn't dreamed of before. They didn't need to hang on the tail. They simply pointed the nose, pressed the button, and 6 machine guns tore the target to shreds. The symbol of this day became Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu. His story reads like a B-movie script, but it is a documented fact. Vratsiu was having a bad day. His engine was acting up, leaking oil and splattering his windshield. He could barely see through the smear, but he refused to turn back. In 8 minutes, think about that, just 8 minutes, He shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers. He did it with frightening efficiency. He flew up to one, gave a short burst, and it flared up. Vracheu immediately switched to the next. Later, it was calculated that he spent only 360 rounds on 6 planes. That's less than 60 bullets per enemy. Surgical precision. When he returned to the carrier Lexington, he climbed out of the cockpit and was caught by a camera. That shot became legendary, a tired pilot smiling and holding up 6 fingers. But Vracheu wasn't alone. The radio was overflowing with shouts. "Got one! Second one burning! 2 more over there. I'm taking the left." On the carriers, mechanics worked like a Formula One pit crew. Hellcats landed, were refueled, rearmed, and went back into the sky. Some pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties that day. One pilot, upon returning to the ship, dropped a phrase that gave this battle its name. He took off his helmet, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and told his mechanic, "Hell, it was like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The phrase stuck instantly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea went down in history not as Admiral Spruance's strategic victory, but as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By sunset, the sky had cleared. The day's totals were mind-boggling. The Americans lost about 30 planes, most of them due to accidents or running out of fuel while landing in the dark. The Japanese lost over 350 planes. 350. It was annihilation. Effectively, on that day, June 19th, 1944, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an organized force. They still had carriers, but there was no one left to fly them, and nothing to fly. The Hellcat proved its concept. It wasn't the prettiest, it wasn't the fastest, but it was an absolute dominator, created to grind the enemy down on an industrial scale. But behind all this bravado and shouts of victory lay one dry figure. A statistic that draws a line under this whole story. 19-1. Think about that number. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, 19 Japanese planes were destroyed. This isn't just a victory. It is a statistical anomaly. In the history of warfare, rarely is there a weapon that so totally outclassed the enemy. In just 2 years of active service, pilots in the F6F Hellcat shot down 5,163 enemy aircraft. That is more than any other Allied plane in the Pacific. Of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in World War II, 75% belong to this fat fighter. It produced more aces than any other plane. 305 American pilots became aces sitting in the cockpit of a Hellcat. But these numbers tell only half the story. The second half was forged not in the sky, but on the ground. Remember how the Japanese prided themselves on their art of hand assembly? How they polished every Zero like a katana? America responded to this with brute industrial force. The Grumman factory in Bethpage worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At one point, they reached a production rate that seems like science fiction. One new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour. In total, 12,275 were built. Japanese pilots faced a nightmare. They could be brave. They could be experienced. But they were fighting a hydra. For every American shot down, 2 new ones arrived. For every damaged carrier, 3 new ones came, their holds packed with brand new, shiny F6Fs. The irony of fate is that the very traits the Japanese mocked the Hellcat for became the cause of their demise. They laughed at its weight, but that weight was armor that saved American pilots, allowing them to accumulate priceless experience while Japanese aces burned in their paper planes. They laughed at its size, but that size allowed it to carry more fuel and ammo to chase the enemy to the ends of the earth. They laughed at its crude shape. But that shape hid a design that could be assembled by the hands of simple workers, former farmers and housewives, in quantities unthinkable for the Empire. The story of the F6F Hellcat is a lesson on the nature of war. Elegance loses to reliability, art loses to industry, and hubris is always punished. Japanese admirals thought the warrior's spirit was more important than metal. The Hellcat proved the opposite. If you have enough metal, enough horsepower, and enough .50 caliber machine guns, the enemy's spirit will break on its own. In the end, the Zero remained in history as a legend. Beautiful, dangerous, but fragile. The Hellcat remained in history as a working tool of victory. And when the last shot rang out over the Pacific, it was this clumsy, heavy, and ugly plane that reigned in the sky, having cleansed it of rivals. They called it a flying tank, and like any good tank, it simply rolled right over them.